Now recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
And once again, I'm Antoine at the Rochester Public Library, Local History and Genealogy Division, and we're very happy to introduce Cheryl Sampson today as our Rochester's Rich History program presenter for the month of February 2022.
You know what? I think I'm going to need to share my screen again because I'm going to have some sound and I didn't click the button for that, so I apologize. So let me try this again. Oh, all right. I'm having a time here. But we'll just go with this. All right, so good afternoon. We're going to be talking about Reverend Thomas James for the next 40 minutes or so. I want to say that when we do this study of Thomas James, it really kind of expands our knowledge of the 19th century life in America. So we're going to talk about that. But before we get really into it, got this little crazy thing here before we get started. I wanted you guys, if you have questions at any time during the presentation, to use the chat feature. And most of us by now, after 2 years of pandemic, probably know all of this. Throughout the presentation, because we're not in person, it would be great if you would use your reactions. You know, if you like what's been said, surprised by it, and you know that with the ellipses, you can get some additional ones. So all of these that look familiar, usually from our phones or Facebook, social media, we have those same ones. So please feel free to use those throughout the talk. When we get to the Q&A time, if you would raise your hand again from the reactions button and raise your hand, and then Antoine will call on you. And when you are called on, then you can unmute yourself, ask your question, and then mute yourself back. So that just sort of helps with the sound for everybody. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about, just a little caveat, about the genre of this book, and then how this autobiography came to be. We'll do that first. So one of the things too is about difficulties for me as a researcher, being able to look at the autobiography and think about, you know, why was it written? And usually people who write an autobiography, they're trying to explain their point of view. And then sometimes they often omit their own thoughts or disagreements. So that will be omitted. The other piece about it as we go through this is thinking about memory and realizing the age of the person that's writing it, and how sometimes we can conflate memories, especially when they are associated with trauma of some sort. And the other piece that kind of makes this difficult is that very few written records are there to provide evidence to support the lives of Black people, especially from the 19th century. So in terms of the genre of writing, this autobiography by Reverend Thomas James, A Wonderful Eventful Life of Reverend Thomas James by himself, is in the form of a slave narrative. And the slave narratives in the 17th and or the 18th and 19th centuries were used as an abolitionist tool to convince whites of the evils and horrors of slavery. And they're also used to convey the humanity of Black people. Most were written between 1760 and 1865. So, and I'm sure we all know examples of this. Evidence in the life of a slave girl, Harriet Jacobs, 22 Years a Slave and 40 Years a Freeman, which was Austin Stewart. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, by him, of course, and 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northrop, just to name a few. And Reverend Thomas James' autobiography is written in this style, even though he wrote this after slavery had ended. So another little piece about his autobiography, he wrote this in 1887, but he dictated it to his daughter, Eliza. And Eliza is the daughter that went with him to Louisville, Kentucky. So if you all have read the autobiography, you would hear, he mentions this daughter, but he doesn't give her a name. But her name was Eliza James. And the portraits that I have here, I just want to mention, I'll probably mention this again later. Catherine Golden Anderson is a second great granddaughter of Reverend Thomas James. And she shared these portraits, a number of these portraits, in an article back in 1984. And I have used these to give sort of a face to some of the people that we'll be talking about. So the first thing we want to talk about is slavery in New York. In the autobiography, it really starts out, I was born a slave at Canajoharie, this state, in the year 1804. I was the third of 4 children, and we were all property of Asa Kimball. So in 1626, the Dutch brought Africans to the colony of New Amsterdam. Usually they refer to them as 11, but some historians believe it was more than that they were just counting the men. So, but at any rate, around this time, the Dutch brought Africans to what is now New York, but was called the colony of New Amsterdam. And then in 1799, New York passes the Gradual Manumission Act, which gradually freed children born to an enslaved woman after July 4th, 1799. So if you think about when Tom, and we'll call him Tom at this point because that was what he was called when he was enslaved. Asa Kimball, who was his enslaver, was to teach Tom to read by the time he was by 1825. And then Asa Kimball was to free him by 1832. So one of the things that you find in some of this is that even though we had these laws in New York State, people didn't always follow them. So we will find that he, and then for some of you all who have read this, will find that he knew nothing about reading by the time he was 17 and had escaped. But Tom thought that his master was well-to-do, a little rough, not really a religious person, but he treated him well, which was interesting given the fact that he didn't follow the laws as were prescribed. But in doing this study of him, I find that I'm looking at his autobiography, and then I'm also paying attention to some of the things that we can find, whether we're looking at census records, any of the records. I would try to find information that would sort of match and sort of put this into a context and see if I could find some additional information. And of course, in 1810, in the census, for those of you who are genealogists, you know that if you look at those census records back then, the only name is the head of household, which were primarily the men. There were women listed if they were the head of household, but none of the other members of the household were listed at this time. But as you will see here, for this number, Asa Kimball lived in Canajoharie, New York. He had family members, but 2 of the people listed in his household were enslaved. Because there are no names, we don't know whether or not that was Thomas James, but I'm assuming that it was. The The other thing that I mentioned earlier, how sometimes the dates don't line up. Here is one of these cases where if in 1810, there were two enslaved people in the household, then there should have included his parents, his mother and his brother and sister, and one sister at least, but the household probably did not. And if Tom was born in 1804, then he would have been around 6 years old at this point, and his mother and brother and sister should have still been there. But one of the things when it comes to memory, Asa Kimball may have sold Tom's family earlier than he remembered, or Tom may have been born earlier than he really knew. So the other thing in looking at this has to do with names. There are so many Asa Kimballs, which was fascinating to me because it didn't sound like a very common name, but it turns out for that particular time it was. And one record that I saw, which was kind of striking, is this record that says, well, gee, here's an Asa Kimball that went to fight in the War of 1812. So the question is, was this our Asa Kimball? Why did he go to war? Did he need the money? Or did he believe in the ideals of war? All those kinds of questions came to me. But in 1812 or 1813, Tom would have been around 8 years old. And so this is when I started to think about how memories can tend to conflate if you have trauma. So if Tom's family was sold, it could have been possibly earlier, and then he might have also experienced trauma if this was in fact Asa Kimball who left for war. So the other thing that is mentioned is Asa Kimball died. It turns out we don't know exactly when he died, but he died without a will. And there was a probate held March 18th, 1822. So we know that he died probably in 1821 or at the latest early in 1822. Asa's wife, Elizabeth, and a Seth Wetmore, who is probably a good friend of his, were the administrators, and they sold his all of Asa Kimball's goods, chattels, and credits to settle his debts. And perhaps Tom was included in the chattels. So I wasn't able to find an inventory. If we had the inventory, then that way we would know whether or not he was included. So I mention all of that because then the next part of the story is that Tom was sold to Cromwell Bartlett and then traded to George Hess. And so another piece in terms of understanding
It seems like Cheryl's video may be paused. Let's try to give it 1 second.
This
Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure how much of that you heard, but let's see. The main thing about this slide is that neither Bartlett or Hess had in their census records that they owned slaves. So it's not clear, and I'm sure that the memory that Reverend Thomas James had of them was correct, and perhaps they did not record the fact that they had enslaved people. All right, so the other thing that we learn about slavery at this point is that Tom escaped on the Underground Railroad. We don't normally think about the Underground Railroad being originated in New York, but during this time it did, and a number of people used this route. He left Canajoharie probably around 1822. He went along the unfinished route along the Erie Canal, arrived in Lockport, then went to Canada from Youngstown. He worked there, and when he thought it was safe to return, he did. So when he returned, the other piece that we learned from looking at his life about the 19th century is education and Christianity were linked. That people went to their churches, set up schools, and which was a very common practice. There was no public education at this time. Usually the wealthy would have tutors for their children, or churches would set up schools. And so when Reverend Thomas James gets back to Rochester, he takes a class, but he also joins a church, he says, on Eli Street. And it turns out that Austin Stewart, who many of us may know from the Rochester area, Austin Stewart owned the first, he was the first Black person that owned a store here in Rochester. And that's sort of his claim to fame here that most people know, but he also was a trustee of this church. And it turns out that this was the AME church founded by Richard Allen out of Philadelphia in around 1787. But Austin Stewart also was a founder of a Black community in Wilberforce, Canada. And the thing that's important to note about that, which we'll discuss a little bit in another slide, is sort of the philosophy that the AME church had versus the AME Zion church had when it dealt with what I will call the Negro problem or the Negro question. And that is, what would you do with the enslaved person if you freed them? How will they integrate or not into American society? So one of the things here is from the Eli Street Society had ceased to exist. This is what Reverend Thomas James said. Its death having been hastened by internal quarrels and by dishonesty among its trustees. And he was referring to Austin Stewart in this case. So Jim, and I changed his name to Jim because if any of you've read his work, then you know that while he was working, people called him Jim. And it's very interesting that as Black people at that time didn't really have control over what they were called. And so, you know, in some cases would just accept that just to be able to get along. But Jim wanted to learn how to read. Once he found out that there was such a thing as reading and religion, he was ready to really kind of suck all of that in. So he went to Mr. Freeman, who had opened a Sunday school of his own for colored youth. And when we talk about education and religion, this is all kind of connected. Going back to this genre of literature, the slave narrative is also sort of this thinking among the newly freed, even of Black people. The whole time you're trying to be free, you're trying to be integrated and trying to be a part of society. And one, I don't know, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that you're going to do is get your education. And the next thing that you're going to do is to get religion. And your education means, or you learn to read, means that you have some intelligence, which a lot of white people didn't believe Black people had. And if you're able to become a Christian, then that means you have a soul. And in the thinking of Black people at that time, they were believing that, okay, if I could do that, then I would be able to be accepted in the larger community. So the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church is what Thomas James eventually joined. And that church was founded by Bishop James Barrett out of New York City in, and I put 19, but of course it's 1876. Um, and in his autobiography, he said, I was ordained as a minister in May of 1835 by Bishop Rush. And here's a picture of Bishop Rush. In 1828, then he founded this African church on Favor Street. This was probably the second building. It says the first church is the first or the second one. The building is still there today. Another church uses it. And it is a different building, but it was the building that's there today was built after Reverend Thomas James had passed away. One of the things that I wanted to mention, and I included this, and this is from 1839, um, even though he moved away for a bit and did a number of different things, it is very clear that this particular church had his heart. He really loved this church. And so whenever there was an issue with money for this church, he would always come through. And this is an example of him raising money in support of the church. And after he raised the money, there was an article in the paper. He put an article in the paper thanking people for their donations. So in 1831, he became an abolitionist. He was introduced to the African Colonization Society and by Judge Sampson, who was in Rochester, and he also gave him some anti-slavery literature by Arthur Tappan. And it was these set of documents, as he says in his autobiography, that really turned him on to really wanting to work to free all Black people and to make the colored man become the equal of the white in the eye of the law, if not in the sight of his neighbor of another race. And that became his life's mission. So one of the things that I wanted to take a moment here and talk about, and in his book, he called it the African Colonization Society. It was actually called the American Colonization Society. And then there was the American Anti-Slavery Society that that Reverend Thomas James was a part of. And so just to kind of compare the two, one was formed, the American Colonization Society was formed in 1816 by Robert Finley, and their objective was to send free Blacks to Africa, primarily Liberia, as an alternative to abolition. So they were not into ending slavery. What they were saying, for Blacks who were free, we should have them leave the country. And it turns out that the African Methodist Episcopal Church supported that idea to a certain extent. So I'm not saying that they didn't believe that slavery should end, but they definitely believe that there should be an alternative for Black people to leave the country. And so Liberia was one location, and some of you may know Sierra Leone, another one, Nova Scotia, another place, Haiti, which also involved Frederick Douglass, and a number of other places as well, that the AME Church sponsored Black people to move to these locations. The American Anti-Slavery Society, on the other hand, was founded by William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan in 1833. Their objective was to end slavery in America, to educate and integrate the Negro in American society. And the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church followed those tenets. And so there's always the Negro question. So even when it came to the gradual um, emancipation of Blacks in New York, the reason why it was stated that it took so long is because people had to answer, well, after you free Black people, what do you do with them? And that has always been the question. And for the American Anti-Slavery Society, what they would say is that you would educate them and integrate them into American society. So in 1833, the Anti-Slavery Society had a magazine or a newspaper that they published that Reverend Thomas James participated in. It was called The Rights of Man. It was published here in 1834. And part of the work that he did was to go out, tour the country and get people to buy subscriptions and talk to them and lecture them against slavery. So that was the whole point of that. At the same time, as part of his calling to preach, um, Reverend Thomas James spent time building churches, and he was sent from the AME Zion Church to go to various cities to build these AME Zion churches. And whenever he would get there, yes, he would build the church, but he was also doing the work of this anti-slavery society. And he did that across a number of different places. So Rochester, he started his church here. He then moved to Syracuse, moved to Ithaca, Sag Harbor, Long Island, New Bedford, Boston, and then came back to Rochester. But then he went to Louisville, Ohio, Kansas, and then to Lockport, and then came back to Rochester, but not to preach at that point. Um, the one thing that I will say, for some of these churches, which is amazing, many of them still exist in some form today. The church that's on Favor Street in Rochester, some of you may know, now exists as the Memorial AME Zion Church that's on Clarissa Street here in Rochester. These other churches exist in Syracuse. The one in Ithaca still exists. Sag Harbor still exists. The other ones I couldn't find, but it doesn't, just because I couldn't find them or couldn't tell if there were multiple churches, if they were connected to Reverend Thomas James, even when I called one of them and they didn't even know for sure whether their church or another church in town was connected to Reverend Thomas James. So in a lot of cases, these churches still exist, which is amazing when you think about it. So when Reverend Thomas James came to New Bedford, Frederick Douglass and his family were already members of this church. And one of the things that Frederick Douglass did, he impressed him in the way that he spoke. And so as Reverend Thomas James was still participating in anti-slavery work, he did that in New Bedford and everywhere that he went. Frederick Douglass was in attendance at one of these meetings, and he asked him to come up and speak. And when he did, he was, received very favorably by the people in attendance. And from that point on, he was participating in the American Anti-Slavery Society and doing the same circuit of going and speaking to people around the country to convince white people, especially in the North, that slavery needed to end. And that was the work. The other thing that I should mention too is that he also, over time, grappled with what to do with the Negro. And at some point, much later than when he first started, as I'm mentioning here, he became an ambassador to Haiti. And, part of the work was, working with the people who lived there, but also providing a location for people who wanted to immigrate out of the US, for Black people to do that. And so that was always still a question for the people of the day. Now, the other part, the abolitionists, which we kind of talked about, and also the Civil War. One of the facts that I saw that really amazed me is that Reverend Thomas James freed 2,000 slaves. And you would think that if that were the case, that when we are studying history, whether high school or college, we would have heard of him in this context. And that was not the case. And so this was amazing to me to learn this about him. And of course, trying to find out in what context did he do that. So while he was doing this anti-slavery work, he there were a number of different things mentioned in the book, and I'm not going to go into details, but he talked about a young girl named Lucy that he helped escape from slavery in Massachusetts, using the laws of Massachusetts and taking them to court, which was very interesting to me when I was studying that, because all of his life and the things that I learned really challenged what I knew about people, Black people at that time, and their ability to navigate in the dominant society. This was very interesting to me, these types of things that he was interested in. And so also the Amistad situation with the people who came on a Spanish ship that they overtook and came back, and it took several years, but he was involved in that as well, maybe peripherally, but still involved in trying to settle what would happen with these captives. There was a story about Anthony Burns, who escaped in a stowaway ship. He was arrested and tried under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, but was able to get free. Then another couple, William and Ellen Craft, where Ellen was biracial. She was able to dress as a white man and have William as the person that was working for her enslaved person working for her, and they were able to escape in that way. But one of the things that was really interesting when he said it broke up the practice of having a colored railway passengers go to Jim Crow cars. And that was something that happened that changed the laws in the state of Massachusetts. So in 1862 to 1865, he was in Louisville, Kentucky, and he worked as a U.S. police officer through the Army during the war. He worked under orders initially of General Burbridge, but then his successor, General Palmer, who really spent most of the time and gave him what I would call extraordinary support. Of course, General Palmer was an abolitionist and he was fighting on the Union side. But a lot of times we find in our studies of even the people who were against slavery were not necessarily supportive of Black people. And that was something that even in reading General Palmer's autobiography, some of it, he was also very supportive of Black people, in a way that it would look like in the 19th century. I think if you put your 21st century hat on and you're, sort of looking at it, 20th century hat even, it might look different and feel different, but for the time, he was quite supportive. And now, Reverend James brought his daughter with him. One of the things at this point, his wife had passed away. His wife died in 1841. Eliza James was born in 1841. Even though I have not found the any death certificates, I'm thinking that her death was associated with childbirth. And so Eliza James was probably with her father for a lot of the time. And so she was in her 20s and she goes with him to Louisville, Kentucky. While he was there, he actually brought AME Zion Church to Louisville, Kentucky, and he established housing for the emancipated slaves and those and established schools. I just want sort of take a moment for some of us. I know just last year our country has established looking at the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth and celebrating that. One of the things we have to remind ourselves is that those states that were the border states that did not succeed from the Union, the enslaved people in those states were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And so what happened would be Union soldiers would come to those states and those cities and towns, and the enslaved would be freed by the work of those Union soldiers and those people that would come to them through the American Missionary Society, or in the case of Reverend Thomas James, being appointed by the government. And so what he ended up doing, you convince the men to sign up as soldiers, they would obtain their freedom, and the women to marry these Union soldiers, and they would obtain their freedom. And some of the things that he would do is go throughout the city. They had these slave pens, and the pens were there for people who were being sold, kept in pens until they were sold, and he went in and removed them from those pens. The other thing he would do would be to go to homes and remove people from Black people from these homes to tell them they were free. And so I guess after he did all of that, and you add up all the people, that's where you get to 2,000 slaves. And and it's a wonderful story to be able to really understand what happened during that time, that we might not always think about when it comes to the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and freeing slaves. And that really, it was the 13th Amendment that basically sealed the deal, in a sense, for ending slavery. And then when someone, and I said he was very audacious. He, just step in and the kinds of things that he was doing, but it was not without controversy. So he's there in Louisville, Kentucky. He brought the AME Zion Church. The AME Church was already there. Baptist churches were already there. Black people, there were a mixture of free Black people and enslaved Black people in Louisville, Kentucky. They were all able, to participate in church. And when he came, he came with this new faith. He came in really saying that the AME Church was not legitimate. There were certain things that at least the author of this letter to the editor accused him of. And there were Black ministers there that spoke against him, because he came, so he's got the backing of the army. He's coming with, sort of this powerful, heavy hand. And they knew that when he left, and when the Union Army left, that the people who would remain there in Louisville would be at the mercy of the white people who were in power in the city. And so this was interesting. There were this letter, and then another letter from a Black Baptist minister that really spoke against him and the work that he was doing there. And so the final thing that I wanted to talk about was family. In the book, he said in 1929 he married a free colored girl, and by her had 4 children. Then he said his wife died in 1841. Then he married again and had 2 more children. So altogether, he had 7 children, of which 6 were biological. And for the most part, they all lived in the same neighborhood in Rochester. So in that 3rd, 8th ward around Tremont Street. He also mentions that he found his brother. And so I always say I found his brother too, because that took some effort to figure out who his brother was. His brother was Archibald James, and he died in 1884. Archibald James was married, and he had a family that lived in Rochester as well. Uh, I mentioned the deaths of some of these other people. His stepdaughter died in 1886. She was 20 years old. Ida James, his biological daughter, died in 1887. She was 16. She died the year that he wrote this autobiography. Uh, and I'm sure that, if you think about it, when he wrote this autobiography, his right hand was basically paralyzed. He was blind because he had cataracts and could not afford to have them removed. And in fact, one other little piece about his book, when he wrote the book, part of what he was doing was selling the book to help him save up money to pay for the cataract surgery that he needed. The other thing, the daughter that had been with him in Louisville that actually wrote the book from his dictation, after the book was written, she died in 1889. And then her daughter, Florence, died in 1890. So, even at the point that he wrote the book with having his brother and his stepdaughter, who he really, considered a daughter. I put step here just to clarify, but he had to be in such a state when you think about all the things that he had done and to get to, this point in his life. So I just wanted to show just a little bit of his family. Um, Here he is. His first wife was Marianne McIntyre, and with them they had 4 children. Only 2 of them I know at this point what their names were. Um, he married Esther Jones, and they had 2 children, and plus she had a child when they came into the marriage. The interesting thing about Esther Jones, her family was in Pennsylvania. This is where he met her. I found an article that said that her mother, I believe her mother was 106 when she died. And in the article, it said that she was enslaved in Virginia. She had 12 children. And by the time she was an adult, of course, they were all sold in different directions. But by the time slavery ended and they ended up in Pennsylvania, she found 10 of her 12 children. So, and I thought that was interesting to mention about the family. And again, Archibald James, I mentioned as his brother. And his daughter, Elizabeth James, was married to Benjamin Thomas from the city of Rochester. And he was very active in the Republican Party and getting out the vote between Black men in Rochester and Buffalo. So I thought that was interesting to mention about the family. And Eliza James, and I'm going through this because I want to eventually get to the person who I was able to get some pictures from her collection. Elizabeth James had children, and one of her children was this Eliza Thomas. She had a number of them. I don't have a lot of information about most of them, but at least with this Eliza Thomas, I do. And then Eliza Thomas was married to a man named Theodore Jefferson, and she had one daughter named Lillian Jefferson, who married a man named Gunther Golden. And the 2 of them had 2 children, Charlotte Golden and Catherine Golden. And Catherine Golden did a interview that part of the collection at the library. So part of the Rochester Voices. So I wanted to show all this to get to her, just to be able to give her credit, and also to give her credit for doing the work for years to try to keep Reverend Thomas James' memory alive. So then we come to the end of his life, and he was deeply saddened by the lack of support from people who he worked with for years in the anti-slavery work. And and if you've read his book, you see where he gets to the end where he's saying the white friends are inclined to leave us to our own resources. And so really left alone to do and to fend for themselves. And he mentioned, some of the issues that he noticed in 1887, which really still exists today, in terms of the young people not having this, coming from schools, having the skills that they need to earn a living from themselves. And the other, and I think, I'm not sure if I clicked on my, when I got back in again, if I said do my sound, but one of the things, the other thing that I wanted to mention is very similar to the civil rights movement, where there was music as a part of the movement, where people would get together when there were meetings or church rallies. There would be music. There was the same with the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. And one of the songs was the Bereaved Mother. And in his autobiography, he talks about being able to play that. And I can't remember if I actually did my sound. So I don't know if you all are hearing that or not, but I'm not gonna, let's see, let me keep going. I'm looking at the time. And the last thing that I wanted, one of the last things I wanted to say was he wrote, had a will, his last will and testament, which he did March the 12th, 1891. In 1891, he had a $200 mortgage held by the Monroe County Savings Bank. In his will, he gave his property at 144 Tremont Street to his wife, Esther. And he also took that property and sort of divided, because at this point, when he wrote his will, he had two children still living. So Thomas, his son, and then the third part of the property, or in the third article in here, he gave property to his daughter, Nancy. And in the will, he kept saying, if she survives me. So I interpreted that to mean that she may have been ill. I have not found definitively when she passed away, but I believe it could have been shortly after he did. And just a point of reference, it's kind of hard to see how this is situated, but he actually had a house that shows up on this 1887 map that you could find at the library. And the house was situated on the north side of Tremont Street, and it runs between Reynolds and Ford, this block. So the block is still there. The houses are numbered differently, so it's not clear whether or not the house is still there, or and with the new number, or the house is no longer there. And when he died, and I'm just giving just these three examples, there were literally hundreds of articles from all places all over the country that listed his obituary, which also surprised me from the standpoint that, gee, he really did go all over the country preaching this gospel of abolition. And so whether it's a little small article or a big article, and from places like Nebraska or San Francisco, Hartford, Connecticut, they all listed an obituary for him. And in the end, when you get to, if you were to see where he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery, it's really this unassuming grave marker. Unlike, if you've ever been in Mount Hope Cemetery, you'll see some very elaborate headstones. His is just this plate on the ground, very simply, says Reverend Thomas James, 1804 to 1891. And so that's the parts of his life that I wanted to pull out today. One of the sentiments in a document 100 Years of AME Zion Church, uh, written in 1895. It said Reverend Thomas James was more an anti-slavery lecturer than preacher, and yet he could preach. He was more ready to fight when he thought of the enormities of slavery. He held a position in connection with the Freedmen's Bureau about the close of the war, in which he distinguished himself by his fearlessness in defending the rights of the freedmen. So want to thank Christine Radarski and Antoine McDonald inviting me to come and do this talk and supporting me as I did it. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so Antoine.
So thank you for that, Cheryl. And I thank you for your presentation this morning, all the, insightful information. We can give Cheryl a quick round of applause for her great presentation on this afternoon. So we have 2 questions so far in the chat box. So let's go ahead and start with these 2 questions. Both of these questions are from Ralph. And the first question was, were both Finley, Lloyd, and Tappan in Rochester?
William Lloyd Garrison was in Massachusetts. Finley, I'm not sure if he was here in Rochester. And Tappan was he was not in Rochester, and now I can't remember where. I'm sorry. And you had another question?
There was one more question. Let me read this other question, Ralph, and then I see your hand raised. I'll let you go. The second question was also from you, Ralph. Where was the Ellie Street AME Church?
Okay, so if you're from Rochester and you're familiar with the Convention Center, and the Convention Center is on, I believe that's East Main and South Avenue, so St. Paul, South Avenue. Behind the Convention Center is where Eli Street was. So if you were to go there, what's there now is the loading dock for the Convention Center. And it was a short street that went from about where the Convention Center is all the way across South Avenue and maybe a little ways across it. I think there is like the city has some building there. I'm not quite sure exactly what that is, but it would have gone straight across, but now buildings are there instead.
So those were the 2 questions that I received in the chat box. Like I said, both were from Ralph. But I see, Ralph, your hand is raised now, so feel free to go ahead and start talking now.
Oh, Ms. Sampson, thank you so much for all of this hard work putting this together. Oh my goodness, this is really good information, especially since isn't the Memorial AME Zion, their anniversary's coming up then in just a few years, right? Is it 1827 or somewhere around that?
Right. It would be 1828. I think there's some people here from Memorial. I'm not sure what year they celebrate exactly for that anniversary, but yeah, you're right. It would be coming up in a few years.
I'm on the ministerial staff at Memorial AME Zion Church. My name is Damon Wilson. Nice to meet you all again. Wonderful presentation. I just wanted to answer that quick question. We celebrate 1827 as our anniversary date. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you for that.
We also have one more question in the chat box from Tynese Edwards. Great presentation, many mixed emotions for me. Is it just a coincidence that the judge you spoke of was last name Sanson like you, or are you related?
It's a coincidence. I am not related. Not at all. Mm.
Any more questions or comments?
This is Ralph. I have a question. I was just kind of curious. You know, there's the relationship with Susan B. Anthony, with Reverend James and the church.
I have not found a relationship with the two of them in particular, but definitely with the church. So by the time that I see a connection with Susan B. Anthony and what was then the African church, um, she was involved with a woman named Hester Jeffrey, who was also a member of that church. And Hester Jeffrey came here from Boston when her father-in-law died. And her father-in-law was the 8th pastor of what is now Memorial AME Zion. And so Hester Jeffrey's sort of claim to fame, she was very much involved in the women's suffrage movement. Her and Susan B. Anthony were very close friends. When Susan B. Anthony died, she eulogized her at the funeral. And when they rebuilt, the African church rebuilt on that spot on Favor Street in 1906, they built a church, and they had these windows, stained glass windows. And one of the windows was a window that honored Susan B. Anthony. Those windows exist now, and I'm not sure if all of them do, but exists now in the Memorial Church that is on Clarissa Street now. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, I was wondering if I may, just one more. That Fugitive Slave Act must have been just a huge violent impact, you know, in terms of the entire anti-slavery movement. I'm just wondering if they're good resources to read about what was happening in terms of the movement, just in general, or if you have some recommendations on things to look into to understand what was going on during that whole period, because it was a lot.
Right. I'm not sure I can offer any anything, but I will say one of the things I just recently reread is Austin Stewart's autobiography, and I'm looking at it in the context in which he wrote it. So you think about, and I believe he wrote it in 1856. I might have that wrong, but one of the things that happened during like the 1840s, 1850s, they states that might not have had slavery, due to the Missouri Compromise, they might not have had slavery, but they definitely were instituting Black codes, Negro codes they would have. And so there was this feeling from when I was reading Austin Stewart's autobiography that there wasn't going to be an end to slavery. So he wrote his book really to, hone in that slavery was wrong. So you would, perhaps others, and I said I needed to go back and look, but since I just recently reread his, I know that he wrote his as a response to what was going on with the Fugitive Slave Act. So, I could imagine that it devastated churches. You weren't able, people weren't able to gather because you were afraid that if you didn't have the proper paperwork, you might not be able to say that you were free. So, I would say for what the studying that I've been doing, I've been starting to look at some of the slave narratives to just sort of get a feel for what was going on at the time. So if you were to get some that were um, written around that time, that would give you sort of a sense of what was going on. So I don't know if anyone else on the call would know of any other books, but I don't happen to know any right now.
Before we move on, I know we have two more hands raised, Rose and Jim. We're going to start with Jim and then Rose in order that I saw their hands raised. But before we do that, I just want to bring everyone's attention to the chat box. There was some conversation going on, and I just provided some resources from the Rochester Public Library that can provide more context on the things discussed. So the first link you'll see is an oral history interview from Catherine that Cheryl mentioned earlier. And so this is the original audio of the oral history interview. And so that is the link for that. And the second link that I posted is for another resource called the Rock Historic Map Viewer. And that can be used to view map locations within city limits of Rochester, New York. And so I use that map to look at Eli Street. So if you do want to get a look at Eli Street, where Rochester Riverside Convention Center currently is, you can use that link to get a view of Eli Street. So I just wanted to bring your attention to those, and we'll move forward with Jim and then next Rose.
Yes, first, thank you for a really comprehensive presentation. I'm very grateful. This is a question in general, not specific to the Reverend. When you talked about Liberia, and then you added other examples, Sierra Leone, Haiti, and Nova Scotia, I realized I hadn't thought much about that period. You pointed out AME leaders supported the idea. They didn't believe in slavery, but they thought there should be an alternative for Black people to leave the country. The only association my memory is making to Nova Scotia is some type of connection to New Orleans. And I'm not sure if that's the tie or what the Nova Scotia, I had not otherwise heard Nova Scotia mentioned before in the context that you would understand Liberia.
Right. No, I don't know if there's a connection between that and New Orleans at all. I do know with some, I'm going to throw out another place only because I found this in doing my own family genealogy. In the Dominican Republic, Samana is another place where there was an immigration effort to those countries and sponsored by the AME Church. So, and I can't say if all of them were sponsored by the AME Church, but I do know Liberia and Samana, and in some cases, Haiti. You know, there would people that would go to Haiti, but a lot of those places were not necessarily successful. Samana definitely is. The people are still there. And
Yeah.
I don't know if there is a tie with New Orleans at all.
Well, and Nova Scotia is interesting because it's so geographically and climate so different from all the others. You have southern US and southern countries in America involved in slavery, and you have these other locations from Liberia to the Caribbean. But Nova Scotia is a really different kind of a place.
Right. And it was the same with Austin Stewart. He went to Wilberforce in Canada. So it also, but then you have to realize, I don't have the number of people who have a number of enslaved people and even free people who left the United States to go to Canada. So I don't think weather was an issue, you know, for people who were going there. You know, the main issue was to be able to live freely.
Right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Just posted a link. I just posted in the chat, Jim, that speaks more to the Nova and New Orleans connection. There was definitely a connection there.
Really? Okay, thank you.
All right. Oh, and I'm just looking at the chat, so I'm seeing some things there, Antoine. Robin mentioned the stained glass window. Hester Jeffries Club purchased, and yes. Um, and I would say at the time there was controversy within people wanting that, wanting her to have that recognition. Um, so let's see. And Hester Jeffrey, yes, she was responsible for the first Douglas statue. Uh, Using her influence with the clubs, whether it was the Hester Jeffrey Club or the Susan B. Anthony Club, there were probably ministries within the church itself where they raised money. And I found that she raised quite a bit of money during a time when, there was a little financial depression going on in the country, nothing like the one in the 20th century, but people just didn't have the money, but she was able to come up with money for this statue. Let's see, Antoine,
Yes, if
I'm
I
looking.
may,
Oh,
that's what I'd like to share. Can you see that at all? So I'm going to pull it back and read it. City photographer Ira Stroll brought these to a meeting once. He had a bunch of cards made. This is the stained glass window to Susan B. that Mrs. Jeffrey organized. And so I'll read the back of it. It says, Miss Anthony, a member of First Unitarian Church, had many friends at AME, including Hester C. Jeffrey, also a member of First Unitarian and a fellow advocate of women's rights. Mrs. Jeffrey organized the Susan B. Anthony Club in Rochester and commissioned this window, the first memorial ever to be established in Miss Anthony's honor. It is currently housed inside the Memorial AME Zion Church on Clarissa Street, and I believe these cards are for sale at First Unitarian Church.
Hmm.
So
Nice. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, what are the odds that it would even come up today? I was so surprised to hear about it, but yeah, it's really nice to be able to share it this way.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I see another thing in the chat. Someone asked, did Reverend James found the Favor Street Church before he was ordained? And I'm going to say from the timing, if you believe the dates that were given, the answer to that is yes, because he wasn't ordained until 1835. But it's not clear that he wasn't also maybe previously ordained in the AME church and had a falling out. He was there at the church. So, it's not clear to me. I don't know. There's some other hands. I don't know, Antoine,
Yep.
I wasn't
So
paying attention to who had their hands up first.
yeah, are you all set with your question, Rose? Okay, and so next we'll move on to Mark. I see Mark has his hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi there. Great presentation, Cheryl. Long time. This is Mark Jackson from
Yeah,
Xerox.
right.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi there. I just wanted to say that that card, the image on that card is was manipulated very strongly in Photoshop to try and reproduce how that memorial window might have appeared when it was backlit in its original installation. In the actual window at Clarissa Street, unfortunately, is just mounted against the wall and is not very striking. So that image that Rose showed, I think probably represents what that would have looked like in its original spot.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks for sharing that. And good to hear your voice. It's been forever.
Do we have any other questions or hands raised? I'm looking through, I'm not seeing any more hands raised. Do we have any other questions?
I see Robin's hand is raised and Ralph's hand is raised. I don't
Okay.
know whose hand was first. So You pick who.
I did not see that one either this time, so we're gonna go, let's give Robin a chance really quickly, then we'll jump back to Ralph.
Hello. First thing I want to say is Cheryl and I communicate back and forth through email, but I'm finally seeing her for the first time. So I'm glad I got in on this Zoom conference. I'm also a member of Memorial AME Zion Church, and I can tell you, if you're interested in the stained glass windows, there's a self-guided tour at Memorial AME Zion. They hand you a little booklet. It'll tell you about all the windows there, who donated them and why, and under which circumstances. So you can call Memorial, make an appointment, and give yourself a self-guided tour. Or you can have our secretary, Canajoharie, will call me and say, so-and-so wants a tour. And I also do the tour sometimes. So I wanted to say that. Hester Jeffries and Susan B. Anthony were good friends. And there were some other members of the suffrage movement, at least one other member of the suffrage movement who was a member of Memorial AME Zion and was very involved in the same things that Hester Jeffries was involved in.
Oh, okay, thank you for that.
Mhm.
We can go over to Ralph if you still have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much. So it's just from doing more research. One of the things I was curious about was, during that time frame of when Reverend James, during his ministry and everything, just looking at the Rochester piece of it, where all the churches were located, during around in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s. And I don't know if there's is that the mapping that you were sharing, can you do research that way? Or does the library have, maps of the city for different time frames that one might use to know where churches were located? Because when I go and look at some of the material that's the exhibits that are at the Museum and Science Center, that there's it mentions like First Methodist Church, and I know that Third Presbyterian started the same year as Memorial did, where I go. And so I'm kind of curious where the churches were located, and then who were the leadership of the congregations at the time, and there may be some correspondence or something that, or maybe even in the histories of the various churches that might be of interest. Thank you.
Yeah.
I might be able to answer this question, at least about the library. I'm sorry, Cheryl.
Yeah, go ahead.
At least about the library part of it. So in terms of resources here, we do have one of the resources that I posted in the chat is called the Rock Historic Map Viewer. And that's actually not a library resource, it's a City of Rochester resource. But what it does is it gives you two windows basically where you can have different years. And the earliest year goes back to 1888, if I'm not mistaken, and the most recent year is 2012. And so they're basically interactive maps where you can put in an address and compare it to two different years. So you can have 1 year on this side and then 1 year on the other side and do a comparison of what was at this location in this year and what was currently at this location. So that's one link that I did post. And so that's a very useful resource. And in terms of maps, we do have an extensive online map collection. So I'll also post that link in the chat so you can access the maps that we have online. And a lot of the maps do come with, descriptive indicators, and a lot of the digitized maps that you will see online are also here in the division as well. So that's just a quick, some of the research that we have. And then in terms of providing information in terms of who, attended the church or possibly a leader, some of that information can be accessed in our city directories that date back to the 1800s as well. And that's also accessible online. So I'll put in a link in the chat box to our city directories and to our map collections. And if you're all set with your question, Robin, we'll turn it over next to James.
Oh, I'm done. I'm sorry.
Okay.
First of all, thank you. I appreciate how hard it is to trace and to find documentation from the 1830s, 1840s. And that's really been my focus in relation to Reverend James. In his autobiography, he talks about in 1833, going to some of the towns outside of Rochester. He mentions two physicians, Dr. Reed and Dr. Smith. They were active in the very early Rochester Anti-Slavery Society. I have found an eyewitness account of his being mobbed in Leroy, and it's a dramatic account, more detail than he provides. But then he goes on to talk about some of the other outlying towns that he lectured at. He says that he was arrested in Pike, but there's no mention of the cause or how that played out. Are you aware of any accounts that describe his experiences during these lectures in the early 1830s?
And not the ones that are even local. I had been focusing on maybe some of, because he went south as well, which was fascinating to me. And I started looking at some of those places and looking at it from the standpoint of newspaper articles and how they were presented. So there were a couple that, like one, I think I initially read, and it sounded like he was meeting at a certain place. And, and back in those days, they had much more detail about where events were happening. And even after the event occurred, the deliberations of the event, they would, what was said and put that in the paper. So when I first looked at it, I think I was looking at it from the standpoint, oh, they're sort of saying he's going to be at such and such a place. But then if you were to read an additional article, sometimes it really looked like it was more threatening when he, to say, hey, he's going to be here. So, for the ones who want to do him harm, this is where you should come. It didn't quite say it like that. So I have been really looking just to confirm that that was really the sentiment in the articles, and not focused as much on the locations here locally. So I would be interested to see the detailed account of when he was basically mobbed here,
I found it's a memoir by a man at the time he was young, a young boy in Leroy. And then late in life, he ran into Reverend James and heard James talking about his story. And then this individual came up to James and said, I was there, I saw that. And he published again another memoir. So I actually found that in the local history section.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the library there in Leroy, or
No. Rundell.
Rundell. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for that information.
Do we have any other questions? We're about 5 minutes out from our closing time of 2:30. So I think we definitely have enough time for one or two more questions or so. If not, no pressure.
I see a hand.
Yeah, I'm also a member of Memorial AME Zion Church. And when we moved to our new church on Clarissa Street in 1975, all the glass stained windows were placed. One was missing though, and that was the one of Frederick Douglass. And the trustees was told that the glass stained window was broken and wasn't able to put it in. So, but there was rumors that it might not have been broken. It might have been taken. I don't know for sure, but that was the rumor during that time. So I don't know whether our trustees saw the broken window, but we were told that it was broken. So it was not brought to the AME Zion Church in 1975 when we moved in.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Because that was a very important window.
Yes, yes, it was. And how many windows altogether were there?
Let's see. It's Robin, do you remember? I think it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think 6.
I'm thinking there was at least 9, but 3 of the windows in addition to the Frederick Douglass window, 3 other windows were missing as well.
Okay.
They were smaller windows that individual,
on the side.
the individual people don't dedicate it to their parents or whatever. But
Mhm.
those were gone too. We don't have those either.
No, we don't. I forgot about those.
Wow. Okay, thanks. I was, while we were talking, trying to save the chat, and somehow I'm not able to save the chat. So Antoine, can you save the chat? Because there's some information in there that I'd like to have.
Yeah, I was working on that. I'm gonna work on saving the chat, or at least maybe the links that were posted in the chat. But there was a transcript that was being created, and there is a transcript, and I think we should be able to access this transcript.
Okay.
Antoine, the copy and paste works pretty well. Just scroll through and highlight it all
Okay.
as a backup.
Okay. Alrighty. So it looks like we're at 12:28. Is there any more questions?
Well, I see James and Robin's hands, but I don't know if those are up from before.
Mine is up from before. I don't know how to take it down.
Oh.
Look down at the bottom. It says lower your hand.
You have another question, Rose?
Okay. Well, this has been great. Absolutely great. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all for your interest and questions.
All righty. Thank you, everybody, for coming today.
Have a good day, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheryl, don't leave yet. You can stay. Me and you are co-hosts, so I want to figure this transcript thing out before we hang up.
Okay.
Nice job, Cheryl.
All right. Thank you, Stella. Appreciate you coming.
So yeah, it looks like just like what he said, to do a copy and paste. At least that
Of
way
the
we know
whole thing?
of the whole thing. That way we know at least for sure we captured it. And then what I'll do is I'll go through and get rid of the jumbo stuff. Oh, okay, this comes up pretty good. Oh yeah, this is really good.
Okay. Well, I just did a copy and paste. Okay, I see it. Somebody entered the waiting room. I don't know what that is. Okay.
Yeah, I saw that. Okay, so for some, it doesn't look like it's capturing everything. Mm.
Oh, the copy and paste.
It doesn't seem like it's getting everything. If you scroll back up to the top of the to the chat box, let me stop recording.